Grammar Girl here, I'm Mignon Fogarty, and you can think of me as your friendly guide to the English language. Writing, history, rules, and cool stuff. Today, in honor of National Novel Writing Month, I have an interview with Curtis Chen, who worked on his first and award-winning novel, Waypoint Kangaroo, during NaNoWriMo. We also talked about attending conferences and workshops, taking extreme actions to be able to pursue your creative dreams. And if you're interested in writing short stories in the speculative fiction genre, there's some really interesting information at the end of the interview about that. And now, on to the interview. Hey, Curtis, thanks for talking with me today.
Hey, Manil. Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
You bet. Well, November is National Novel Writing Month, NaNoWriMo, and I recently learned that your first novel, Waypoint Kangaroo, was something you worked on during NaNoWriMo.
Yeah, it was. It was maybe the fourth or fifth time I attempted NaNoWriMo, and the first couple of times I didn't finish, didn't get to 50,000. And Waypoint Kangaroo was maybe the second or third novel. Like I actually got to over 50,000. I think the first draft was maybe 60-some thousand words. And it was like a complete story. I got to the ending and I was happy that I had actually, finished it.
That's great. So had you worked on Waypoint Kangaroo in previous years on Nano? Was it like a sequential thing?
No, so I've always, at least in the early years, I tried to approach it as a new project every year, even if I didn't have any idea when I was starting out. So I've always been mostly a pantser. People talk about pantsers and plotters. So I have generally gone in with a very vague idea of what I want the setting to be and who I want the characters to be, and then just kind of improv'd out different scenes and just see how it was going. And I've sort of developed my own process over more than a decade of doing that.
Do you still consider yourself a pantser?
Yeah, although I'm becoming less so now. I've done a few projects where I've been working with other people, so I have to give them an outline to look at for the collaboration.
And when you're writing, now I'm curious, do you use Scrivener or Word, or do you put Post-its on the wall? Like, how do you organize things as you're working?
So it sometimes depends on the project or the stage of the project. For first drafts, actually, so when I'm doing NaNoWriMo, I will use a little portable word processor called AlphaSmart Neo that I don't think they make anymore, but it actually runs on Palm OS, which was the old Palm Pilot's PDA's operating system.
Wow.
And it's very lightweight and there's no internet on it. It's just a tiny screen that'll show you like 6 lines of text at a time. So really all you can do is just like type in some text. There's no like fancy formatting or anything like that. So I find it really good for me for distraction-free, just getting the first draft out and producing more words and just keep going, because it's hard to, like, you can't scroll back and read stuff, but 6 lines at a time, it's not great for like editing or anything. But yeah, so I will look at the high-level structure in Scrivener, and then that'll help me with the next revision, because at this point, I always go into it knowing that I'm going to get a first draft out, and I'm going to have to go back and fix it, because, like I said, I think of it as sort of doing improv in that first draft. Is like, let's just throw these characters into this situation and see what happens. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. The thing I like about it is a lot of times unexpected good things will happen, and I will see like, oh, this is something interesting I can do with this story that I didn't think of before. But then it does mean like sometimes I'll have to go back to earlier scenes and either backfill or like set up things that I know I want to pay off later on. And then at some point, especially if I'm doing like a collaborative thing or where people are giving me feedback, I'll give them a Word document and then they can put in comments, or during the copy editing phase, the copy editor can actually like make changes using the track changes features, and I can see what they're correcting or querying me about, because sometimes they'll ask, I've been writing a lot of science fiction lately, so sometimes they'll ask about like, is this actually a word, or is this something you made up, or is this spelled right, or stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Yeah.
We should actually back up. Can you tell people about your novel, Waypoint Kangaroo? I read it and I loved it, and I think it was nominated for some awards. But we should tell our listeners sort of what your first novel, and I think your second novel too, is set in the same world,
so
right?
Waypoint Kangaroo is a funny science fiction spy thriller, and it was a finalist for the Locus Awards in the first novel category and the Endeavor Award that same year, which is given out in the Pacific Northwest. So it was really nice to see how people responded to it positively. And the second book is Kangaroo 2 TOO. It's set in the same world and is the second in the series. And and they also out in audiobooks, and I really like the narrator they got. Both books are written in the first person, so the audiobook is in some ways like this extended monologue of this character, either describing what's happening to him or sort of talking to himself about what just happened. And I felt like the narrator, PJ Oakland, really did a good job of sort of understanding the essence of the character, but then he interprets it in his own way, which was fun to listen to as the author, because I wrote it with a certain thing in mind, and it was fun to see.
Yeah, and a good narrator can make all the difference.
Yeah. So
you worked on the first draft of Waypoint Kangaroo during NaNoWriMo, right? And you completed a first draft. And so then what happened? Like, how long did it take then before that novel was, sort of ready to submit or shop around, or how did that all come about?
Right. Yeah. So the very first draft I wrote in 2006, and I didn't actually go back and start revising it until 3 years later, because at that time I still wasn't sure, which book I wanted to try, getting published first. And I was also, wondering, like, do I want to do self-publishing, or should I, try to get an agent and all that stuff. So, for a few years there, every year for NaNoWriMo, I was like starting a different project, something slightly different, and seeing, do I feel better about this than some of the other things? And then after a few years of that, I decided, I kind of want to try to get Kangaroo out there first. Like, I'm still thinking about it, and I have ideas for, future books and series and all that kind of stuff. So, so from 2009 to like 2011, I did a bunch of different revisions. And I have to say that a lot of stuff changed, not just because of, I'd given it to some people to read and they gave me feedback, but I think also because of how I had developed as a writer during that time. Like, I was seeing different things when I looked at the manuscript and like, oh yeah, I can definitely do this better, or I want to do this thing a little differently, or as I mentioned, like, the first draft was only about 60,000 words. So I knew I had to get it to like 90 or 100,000 for an adult novel. That's what publishers want to see for that. Mm-hmm. So, so then I spent a few years revising it and kept revising it. And I didn't actually start querying it to agents until 2013, 2014. And that was a whole nother thing where, you have to write a query letter, which is very different than the novel itself. So I spent a bunch of time researching that and figuring out how to do it. And then got an agent, and we sold the book early 2015, and it came out in the summer of 2016. And we sold the second book in the same contract. So, and that came out the next summer. So, as a shorthand, sometimes I tell people, it took me 10 years to write the first book, and I had to write the second one in 10 months, which is not completely precisely true, but it does give you an idea of, a lot of times as a new author, like, you write one thing that sells, but then the publishers want more stuff from you pretty much right away, so they can, keep selling. If you are very successful, they know readers are going to want more of your stuff. So,
well, one thing that I think is great about NaNoWriMo is that it sets a deadline and a writing schedule for you for at least 1 month. So with nonfiction, which I've written, you sell the idea or the outline, and then you have people waiting for you. So you have real deadlines.
Mm-hmm.
But with fiction, unless you're a rock star, you have to finish the book before you can sell it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's really helpful to have any kind of artificial deadline like that. And I read that, outside of NaNoWriMo, you also made a deadline for yourself that you'd write a new 500-word flash fiction piece every week. And you did that for 5 years. And I'm just kind of blown away. I want to know how you stuck with it. Was it ever hard, or are you just sort of wired to do that in a way that I am not?
No, it was definitely... so I did that from that project. I just started a blog, so I would have public accountability, and I told friends about it, so they would check every Friday to see if I put something new up. And yeah, sometimes it was hard, but I did that from 2008 until 2013, so not quite 5 years. And I think I was able to do that partly because of the discipline I had developed over, the previous several years of doing NaNoWriMo, where, like you said, you have to, at least attempt to produce and figure out, like, okay, you have set this target of, 50,000 words, 30 days. If you write every day, you have to do at least this many words per day. But if you don't write every day, which is generally what I do because I have other stuff going on, and, a lot of people talk about how, like, they could never, do it in November, especially because you have, the Thanksgiving holiday and, you have other stuff going on in your life. But I think part of the philosophy behind NaNoWriMo is that there's always going to be something else going on in your life. And you really just have to figure out how you can find the time to do the writing. And I think generally this applies to any kind of creative art that people are doing that, they're not necessarily getting paid for up front. It's like you make a thing and you don't know what's going to come of it. And that's the other part of it, I think, is that you really have to find some joy in the process of making a thing and creating it and, the whole revision process for writing. And that is something that I had to figure out for myself. And I think every writer is going to be a little different. But having done that for, every year, in November for NaNoWriMo, I was able to, decide that, okay, I want to, do something that is just me. And I want to see if I can do this, every week. I figured 500 words was a manageable amount. Like I could sit down for, an afternoon or a few hours and just get that out, even if they weren't the best words in the world, even if they didn't really make a whole story or make a lot of sense. And that was another thing I definitely got from NaNoWriMo. It's like you just got to get the words out, and you can fix them later. But if you don't have anything on the page, then there's nothing to fix. And I really sort of took that to heart over the years. Like, okay, as long as I have something, I feel like there are different skills as a writer that I use at different times. So like for the first draft, there's definitely one set of skills I use just to, create something new and make things up. And then after I've got a first draft, then I can apply a different set of skills where I look at things a little more critically and say, okay, what is working, what is not, and what can I do to fix it or improve it?
Great. We're going to take a quick break for our sponsors. And when we come back, we're going to talk about writing conferences and how those can help too. And also a really interesting choice that Curtis made about where to live. It's kind of like a choice I made too. So we'll be right back. Today's episode is sponsored by Waterpik. If you drink coffee, tea, or red wine, it can be hard to keep your teeth stain-free. Well, now you can restore your natural bright smiles with the Waterpik Whitening Water Flosser. It removes 25% more stains than brushing alone. The Waterpik Flosser is the perfect solution for those who don't want to use harsh bleaching chemicals or undergo expensive whitening treatments. And this is nothing like the kind of flossing you're used to, which, let's face it, is kind of the worst part of anyone's routine. I like the Waterpik flosser because it feels more clean than regular flossing, and the whitening tablet leaves my mouth feeling minty fresh. I like to use it before bed. It takes just 1 minute to use the Waterpik whitening water flosser, and it's actually enjoyable to do. Receive $30 off a Waterpik whitening water flosser for yourself at waterpik.com/grammar and enter the code grammar. That's waterpik.com/grammar with the code grammar for $30 off. Okay, we're back. So I'm curious, you talked about using different skills at different points in the writing process. And I know from reading bios of you that you've attended a number of writing conferences or workshops that I think you liked. And I'm wondering if, those different skills were things that you developed at these different classes or events that you went to. And if you can talk about the different kind of writing workshops and how do you find a good one? There's so many out there. I just wonder how you find a good one. And it seems like you're happy with the ones you've done.
Yeah. So there are a lot of writing workshops out there specifically. I'm most familiar with the ones in the science fiction, fantasy, horror community because that's, I grew up reading, a lot of speculative fiction. And I was a fan before I, started writing professionally. So I was going to, these fan conventions, things like Comic Cons and local cons. So I kind of became familiar with the community that way. And so a lot of local conventions, like I'm in Portland, Oregon. So every fall, Oricon happens here, and maybe 1,000, 1,500 people locally, and from the Pacific Northwest get together, and there's a lot of panels and costuming and kids programming, and there's also a lot of writing specific programming. So a lot of these cons will have writers' workshops where, if you're going to the con, you can also sign up to submit a piece that gets critiqued by other writers and sometimes professional writers who are going to be there doing panels and whatnot. And then there are specific things. So I did a couple of workshops where you apply with a writing sample and you have to get approved to go. And what they want to see, my understanding is, they want to see a certain skill level, and they want to know that you're at a place in your own development as a writer where you're going to be able to get a lot of benefit from being at the workshop, being critiqued by other people, giving them your feedback on their work, and learning more about specific aspects of craft or whatever it is. So I did, in 2008, I went to Viable Paradise, which is a week-long workshop on Martha's Vineyard. And then in 2014, I went to Clarion West, which is a 6-week summer workshop up in Seattle. And those were both really good, and they helped me in different ways because, again, they were, 6 years apart. So I had developed as a writer. Clarion is something that people talk about as being kind of like a boot camp for writers because it's pretty intense, both in that, you leave home for 6 weeks and you go and live there with like 18 other writers, and a new instructor comes in every week, and you spend all week, everyone is supposed to write a new piece every week that gets critiqued by everyone else in the class. So it's a fair amount of work in just reading everything, and you have 3 or 4 critiques every day, but there's also a good amount of downtime where you get to know the other writers. So a lot of people come out of Clarion West or Clarion UCSD with this cohort of people that they kind of then follow through the years as they start selling more, or people finish that novel that they started at Clarion, or they sell these short stories or whatever. And Viable Paradise, because it was 1 week, was a little more tightly scheduled, I want to say, because every day was like, okay, this is your schedule for the whole day, and this is what you're going to be doing pretty much every hour of the day. So it was a lot of information to sort of get downloaded in that short time, but also a really great experience.
Do you feel like your writing really grew from those experiences, or is it more about just feeling inspired and in networking and getting to know people?
I think it's both, and I think if someone goes into it with an idea of what they want to get out of it, I feel like they might enjoy the experience better, because it is very, very different than having a critique group at home or even online, where you're not doing stuff face to face and you're not sort of all packed into this workshop environment. But yeah, I definitely have kept in touch with a lot of people from both of those workshops and from other conventions that I've met. When my first novel came out, when Waypoint Kangaroo came out, one of my Viable Paradise classmates, Claire Humphrey, her first novel was coming out the week before, and actually from the same publisher also. So we ended up doing a book tour together, which was a lot of fun. So it was fun to be able to share that experience with her, and for Claire and West, a lot of my classmates have been publishing a lot. So it's great to to go online or to like read Publishers Weekly or whatever, and to see them mentioned, and to be able to keep up with them and see how they're developing too as writers and in their lives. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that too. Seeing people I know get published and become more and more prominent. It's so fun to go into a bookstore and see your friends' books.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I definitely recommend people to look at it. And again, I think like NaNoWriMo, it's not for everyone, but I feel like it's worth investigating at least, or certainly for in the case of Nano, like anyone can try that out and decide whether or not they want to continue with it, because. And like one of the things you mentioned, the community is so great that if you're willing to sort of open yourself up a little to talk to other people about what this is like to sort of do this work long term, or try to make it as a career, I think you can really get a lot out of it.
Yeah. Clarion in particular sounds really intense. And I bet a lot of people are thinking, well, I could never take 6 weeks off to go do that. But you did something that I did too, that I think a lot of people don't consider. When you decided you wanted to be a writer, you intentionally moved from the Bay Area to a less expensive place to live. And I did the same thing when I decided I really wanted to do podcasting. And I don't think I've ever talked about it, definitely not on my own show. So I chose Arizona at the time and eventually ended up in Reno, and you chose Vancouver, Washington, and ended up staying there. That's close to Portland for people who aren't familiar with the West Coast. And so can you talk people through making that decision to move and sort of how it helped you become a writer?
Yeah. So at the time, my wife and I were actually calling it the writer move. I think the very start of it was, a couple years before we moved, it was our first wedding anniversary, I believe, and we'd taken a trip up to Napa, and we were on the wine train. So the wine train in Napa, California is it's a train that doesn't actually go anywhere. Like it's 3 hours. It goes from one end of the track to the other, and there's lovely scenery outside. But basically, you just sit on the train. It goes from point A to point B, and then it just comes back to point A. And
and you drink wine.
They feed you. Yeah, they feed you lunch. There's lots of wine. So we were just kind of hanging out and chatting about stuff. And it was our anniversary, so we were talking about a lot of sort of big picture stuff, like what do we want out of our lives together? Are we happy with what we're doing now in our careers and all that kind of stuff? And we were both working pretty high stress tech jobs in Silicon Valley. I was a software engineer, and she was working at a medical device company as a corporate trainer. And so we got to talking about, what would we do if we could do anything? And I'd always been interested in writing. And, since high school, I'd been trying to, write short stories and, send them out, and hadn't gotten anything published at that point, I don't think. But I was, really interested in it, and I just felt like I didn't have the time, or in particular the mental energy after, spending all day, coding software. Like that took a lot out of me, and so even if I could find the time to do writing, I felt like I wasn't, able to really give it all of the attention it deserved. So we talked about it, and we're like, and we kind of came up with the idea of, okay, we could, we're making enough money now, we could probably save some money, and then take some time off, maybe 2 or 3 years. And we looked at, our budget, what we were spending, looked at how much we could save out of, what we were making from our salaries. And we kind of settled on the idea of, we could stay in the Bay Area for, a year, maybe 18 months, or we could go somewhere else that was, half as expensive and stay for 2 to 3 years and like give ourselves time to figure something out. So yeah, we made a big spreadsheet and looked at a bunch of different parts of the country. I think Sacramento was going to be our fallback if we didn't find anywhere that was better, because Deanne had actually lived there before when she was younger. And it was close enough that, it wouldn't be a huge change for us in terms of how we were living. But that is one thing we wanted to do if we could, was to, get farther away from where we were so that we wouldn't be doing the same kinds of, frankly, expensive things that we were doing, like going out with our friends and, eating out at restaurants all the time and, all this other stuff that, just housing is very expensive in the Bay Area. Electricity is very expensive, which we learned when we came up here to the Portland area, because like everything's hydroelectric up here. So our electricity bill went down by 2/3 of what we were paying in California, even though we still have a lot of electronics and computers and all those kinds of toys in our home. Yeah, and we've been able to, so long story short, we've been able to actually stretch that a lot, more than what we saved for just, I think it was 2 years that we, really actively, put a lot of money into savings, knowing that we were going to use it for this part of our lives. But I've done a bunch of freelance work, and my wife has done some part-time and contract work. And, one of those contracts was with a former coworker who was still in the Bay Area. So she would fly down there once a month, and they were paying her, hourly at Bay Area rates. So it went a lot farther where we were living now. So we're still figuring out, the whole finance thing long term, but I feel like we've been very fortunate in that, we were able to, give this a try.
And so by sort of freeing up so much of your time, that gave you both the time and sort of the mental space to work more on your creative writing?
Yeah, I definitely, I went into it, thinking, okay, I'm going to take my writing more seriously. I'm going to make it, the main thing I'm going to work on. And but that said, there was still definitely a period of adjustment because we were living a little differently, and also figuring out how I was going to manage my own time and keep myself motivated. And so the flash fiction project kind of came out of that as a way to make myself produce something every week, even if it was just a little bit of a thing. But eventually, a lot of those. So one big thing I figured out from doing the flash fiction was that I got to a point where I was able to write a really tight, 500-word scene, but it was definitely just the first scene of a longer story. So a lot of those flash pieces I later turned into, longer, 5,000, 6,000 word stories, and then sold them to other markets. So that was overall a very good exercise for me as a writer. Other people may have different experiences, so I do recommend, generally, being able to, set yourself a deadline and meet it, I think is good, because you're not always going to have other people who are asking for stuff from you.
Yeah. Short stories isn't something that I have ever really looked into or been drawn to writing myself, but I understand that there are some really robust markets right now for short fiction. Is my impression correct?
Yeah. There are a lot of markets online right now, especially that are doing really, really cool stuff with short fiction. So Clark's World, Strange Horizons, Uncanny, Lightspeed, Nightmare, which is a horror market. And some of these they're also like doing a lot more translation, getting works from other parts of the world and translating them into English and publishing them for the U.S. and English-speaking market. And Fireside, Faya magazine. There's a lot, and obviously, the print magazines, there aren't as many now, but Analog is still around. Asimov's. What else? Inner Zone from the UK, Black Static, which is also a more horror-y magazine. There's actually a lot of stuff out there. If you are interested in the field of speculative fiction publishing, I highly recommend looking at Locus Magazine. They have a website where they will print excerpts from each issue, but every month they put out a great set of, it's informational because it has a lot of publishing specific information. So definitely for people who are aspiring writers who haven't published a lot yet, it's a great way to learn about, what people are doing, like what's selling now, which agents are making deals out there. But every issue, they also do 2 interviews with different writers who talk about their work and their lives. So that's also, it's a really cool way to sort of get a look at what other people are doing, because like I said, I think every writer is a little bit different and, has to find their own path in their writing career. So it's cool to be able to read about that, even if you're not able to, go to conventions or workshops and meet people and talk to them in person.
Yeah, you can still get that perspective. That's amazing. You just rattled off, 10 or 15 outlets just off the top of your head. That definitely says to me there's a lot out there.
Yeah, and there's a lot more besides that. I know a lot about markets because I volunteer as the secretary for SFWA, which is the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America. So it's a 501c3 public charity, and we're dedicated to helping and promoting writers of genre fiction. And we do a lot of stuff for everyone. You don't have to be a member. If you go to sfwa.org, there are a lot of resources on the site. But as a secretary, I'm the one who's in charge of reviewing markets who want to be qualified as professional markets. So right now, SFWA defines a professional rate as 8 cents a word. And we also have other, requirements like the market has to have been around for at least a year and the circulation has to be at least this much. And in print, it's this. And if you're online, we want, some number of page views a month, I think. But and the point of that is so that, if you're a new writer and you want to know, who is buying the kind of stuff you're writing and who is, actually publishing it and they're paying a professional rate. SFWA kind of tries to do the work of that. Yeah.
So you help people find what outlets are legitimate. Yeah. Great. Well, so to wrap this up, I'm just curious, are you planning on working on anything this November for NaNoWriMo?
I don't know what that's going to be yet, but it's kind of how I usually go into it. So, I've got a few weeks to figure it out. It'll be fine.
And do you have any new books coming out soon? Or in the interim? What do you have in the oven right now?
I don't have any novels coming out. There are a couple of them working on, but I have a story in an anthology that's coming out in early November. It's called Infinite Stars, Dark Frontiers, I believe, and it is set in the Kangaroo universe. So it's sort of a prequel story before any of the novels happens. So if you're familiar with those characters, it's it's kind of fun. Yeah.
Great. And so where's the best place for people to find you online?
I have a website. It's curtiscchen.com. And if you just search for my name, you'll probably, find a whole bunch of stuff. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all the usual places, I guess.
I'm Mignon Fogarty, better known as Grammar Girl. You can find me at the home of my podcast network, quickanddirtytips.com. where you can also find all the other great Quick and Dirty Tips podcast hosts, including The Savvy Psychologist, Everyday Einstein, and The Mighty Mommy. Thank you to my producer, Nathan Sams, and that's all. Thanks for listening.